What if, somewhere out there, in the quiet of the night, secrets lay hidden, secrets waiting to be stumbled upon, lurking just beyond the dim glow of the parking lot light, just out of reach, just barely sensed in the corner of your eye? What if every shadow in the dark carried a warning, ancient and unspoken, daring you to draw closer? Every rustle in the breeze, every creak from an unseen source, whispering as though alive, as if warning you to turn back. There are places we pass by every day without a second thought, but some of them were never meant to be touched, never meant to be seen under the thin veil of starlight that barely reaches their walls. Like the Withered Pines Motel, a place so far off the road that it sits alone in the shadow of an endless forest, shrouded in silence, hiding memories no one speaks of. This motel has stood for decades, outliving its purpose, forgotten by time, clinging to the edge of something different. Those who found themselves within its walls know there are rules that are unbreakable, not just by policy, but by something darker, rules that hold you in place, like threads too thin to see, but too strong to sever. You see, the night shift here isn't ordinary. It comes with rules that you're given before the clock even strikes midnight. Rules like never look outside after midnight, as if the windows were gateways to something lurking just beyond. Or, if you hear a knock from room 13, walk away. Whatever you do, do not answer. There's something about these rules that feels wrong, as if they weren't just written to protect you from a long dead guest list, but to keep something in, to hold back whatever it is that prowls the motel's empty halls, waiting for just one mistake. But even with the rules, you can't shake the feeling that something waits, something watching, something hidden between the flickering lights and cracked wallpaper. And as the hours stretch longer, as shadows grow taller, you'll wonder if the night ever truly ends at the Withered Pines Motel, or if you'll be trapped in it forever. He took the job because he had no other choice. Desperation, they say, drives people to places they might otherwise avoid, places they might sense aren't quite right but can't explain why. The name was the first warning sign. He should have listened to Withered Pines Motel, but it was just a job, he told himself. Just another stop in the long search for stability, an opportunity to pay the bills for a little while. When he first pulled up, he thought it looked like any other old roadside motel, the kind that hasn't seen a full booking in decades, tucked away off a nearly forgotten highway, buried in the wilderness, surrounded by trees thick enough to block out the moonlight. It was old in a way that felt wrong. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving walls spotted with damp patches, their colors drained by time. Weeds clung to the cracked pavement around the building, creeping closer to the doors as though they, too, wanted to see what lay within. The trees around the motel grew impossibly tall and close together, their dark branches twisting over one another like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky, barely letting any light escape. It was silent in a way that didn't belong in the open air, the kind of silence that feels pressed against you, heavy and suffocating, like even the wind had been warned to stay away. He stepped out of his car, pulling his jacket closer against the chill, and instantly felt the weight of the place. There was something wrong here, something thick in the air that pressed against his skin. His eyes scanned the building, taking in every shadow, every broken window, and as he looked, he felt a prickling on the back of his neck, as though someone, or something, was watching him from the darkness. He turned quickly, scanning the tree-line, expecting to see he didn't know what. But there was no one there, just the shadows under the trees, shifting as if they were breathing. He shook it off, but the feeling lingered, settling into his chest, a quiet warning he tried to ignore. After all, it was just an old building in the middle of nowhere. With a leaky roof and flickering lights, places like these always had their quirks. He convinced himself it was nerves, that the stories he'd heard in town were nothing more than local legends meant to keep kids from wandering off at night. But even as he reached for the door handle, he could feel that sense of dread clinging to him, like an unseen hand, pressing into his shoulders, slowing his steps as if to hold him back. He walked into the lobby, its stale air thick with a mix of dust and an odor. He couldn't quite place something old and decayed, like it hadn't been opened in years. The overhead light flickered dimly, casting strange shadows along the faded wallpaper, patterns that seemed to twist and crawl when he wasn't looking. The lobby was empty except for an old wooden desk in the corner, piled with a ledger and a set of keys on a rusted ring. Behind the desk, a solitary lamp cast a yellowed, weak light, barely illuminating the wall behind it. He barely had a chance to take it all in before he heard a voice, rough and low, coming from the shadows. The manager, a gaunt figure with eyes that seemed to have lost their warmth years ago, stood in the doorway, watching him in silence for a moment that felt too long. The man moved with an unnatural stillness, his gaze unblinking, his lips drawn in a line as if he were measuring him, judging if he'd last the night. "You're here for the night shift, aren't you?" the manager asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. Before he could answer, the man reached beneath the counter and pulled out a piece of yellowed paper. "There are rules here," he continued, his voice low and flat, as if he were reading an obituary. "You'll want to follow them." He looked at the paper in his hands, the ink faded and smeared in places, as though it had been held by many before him. And the rules, they were strange, far stranger than he'd expected. Simple things at first glance, yet unsettling in their specificity. Do not look out the windows after midnight. If you hear a knock on room 13, ignore it. Do not answer. Check the mirror in the lobby at exactly 3 a.m. When the lights flicker, don't move. Not a muscle. As he read each rule, a sense of unease grew in his chest, gnawing at his confidence. He looked up, expecting the manager to laugh, to admit it was some kind of initiation prank, a way to scare the new guy, but the man's face remained grim, his eyes dark and empty. He tried to push away the unease that crept up his spine, forcing himself to nod, to play along. After all, he reminded himself, it was just one night, just a few hours until dawn. How hard could it be? But as he watched the manager disappear into the shadows, the door closing quietly behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake, that whatever he had agreed to, whatever he was about to face, would be far more than he had bargained for. And so as he stood alone in that empty lobby, with only the quiet hum of the flickering lights and the distant echo of his own heartbeat in his ears, he braced himself for the night to come. He stood alone in the dimly lit lobby, clutching a crumpled note the manager had left him. The paper felt strange, brittle, as though it had been held by countless hands over the years. His fingers traced over the words, barely believing what he was reading, each line growing more bizarre, more unsettling than the last. He could feel his heart beat faster with every instruction, a dull thud that seemed to echo in the quiet lobby, each beat a reminder of the unknown horror that lay behind these words. The first rule was strange enough to make him pause: do not look out the windows after midnight. He frowned, looking up from the paper at the row of windows lining the lobby wall. They were old, dust-streaked, and smudged, their glass cloudy with age. Through them he could barely make out the silhouette of the trees swaying in the dark, their outlines shifting in the faint moonlight. It seemed harmless enough, a view of nothing but endless forest. What could possibly happen if he looked outside? But as he stared at the windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side, something hidden in the shadows, looming just out of sight. He glanced back down at the rule, a shiver creeping up his spine. Why shouldn't he look out the windows after midnight? What was he supposed to avoid seeing? It was absurd. He almost laughed at the thought. But something in the manager's eyes had told him this was serious, that ignoring even the smallest detail could come at a cost he couldn't imagine. Still, he wondered what would happen if he just peeked. He continued reading, his eyes moving to the next line. If you hear a knock on room 13, ignore it. Do not answer. Room 13. The number alone sent a jolt of unease through him. There was something about it, some primal association with misfortune and bad luck, the kind of superstition he'd always dismissed. But now, standing in that quiet, suffocating lobby, it didn't feel so absurd. He thought back to room 13. It was just down the hall, an unassuming door, faded and chipped, like every other room. But now it felt different, like it was hiding something he was better off never knowing. He swallowed, the air thickening as he read the rule again. Ignore it. Whatever happens, ignore it. But what kind of knock could it be? Who or what would be knocking at such an hour? The thought filled him with an uncomfortable curiosity that gnawed at his resolve. What if he didn't ignore it? What if he opened that door? But then he imagined the manager's voice, that flat, lifeless tone as he handed over the rules. You'll want to follow them. There had been something final in that warning, something that told him these were not rules to test. A creeping fear settled over him, wrapping around him as he repeated the words to himself, almost as a reminder. Ignore it. Whatever it takes, ignore it. As he scanned further down the note, the third rule felt even stranger, almost surreal. checked the mirror in the lobby at exactly 3 a.m. The mirror. His eyes drifted to the far wall, where a large antique mirror hung, its silver frame tarnished and twisted, as though it had been left to rot for years. The glass itself was cloudy, speckled with dark spots, like the aging skin of something that had once been alive. He could barely make out his own reflection, blurred and distorted, as though the glass were hiding something beneath its surface. Why would he need to check it at exactly 3 a.m.? The time seemed precise, deliberate, a detail that felt almost ritualistic. He glanced down at his watch, noting that 3 a.m. was still hours away. The thought of standing alone in front of that mirror, waiting to see something he couldn't yet understand, made his skin crawl. He imagined himself there facing his own reflection, but what if it wasn't his own face looking back? What if he saw something else, something that had been waiting, watching from the other side? It was absurd, he told himself again. A ridiculous notion. But as he stood there, alone in the lobby, he couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this mirror than met the eye. He felt its gaze on him even now, as if it were aware of his presence, as if it knew what he was thinking. And somehow the idea of breaking this rule, of failing to face the mirror at that exact moment, felt like an invitation to something he didn't want to encounter. He read over the rules again, slowly, each line filling him with a mix of dread and a dark, creeping intrigue. They seemed so simple, almost harmless in their phrasing, but there was something about them that felt wrong, as if each instruction held a secret, a truth that had been carefully hidden beneath vague words. And yet, the urge to understand, to uncover what lay behind these strange commands, gripped him with a force he hadn't expected. He wanted to believe it was all just a trick, a test to see if he'd stay in line, but something inside him, a quiet, fearful voice, told him otherwise. He glanced around the lobby, the shadows stretching long across the walls, the flickering light casting eerie patterns along the floor. In that moment, he realized he was truly alone. There was no one else here, no one to hear him if he needed help, no one to warn him if he broke one of the rules. And as he read the list one last time, the words blurred slightly, his mind heavy with an unspoken question. What exactly had he walked into? He folded the paper, tucking it into his pocket as he took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm the growing unease that had settled deep in his chest. He would follow the rules, whatever it took. It was only one night after all, just a few hours until dawn. But as he turned away from the note, the faint flicker of the light overhead, the quiet groan of the building's walls, and the lingering gaze of the mirror seemed to whisper back to him, as if reminding him nothing here was as simple as it seemed. The night began simply enough, with a checklist of small tasks that seemed ordinary, almost mundane. He walked through the halls of the Withered Pines Motel, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence, the air heavy around him. Dust hung in the beams of light from the ceiling, drifting like ghosts of forgotten days. Each room he passed was empty, its door closed, as though the entire motel had been frozen in time, left untouched for years. Room by room he checked each door to make sure it was locked, his hand lingering on the cold metal handles, as if waiting for something on the other side to turn them. The walls creaked with age, and every now and then, a quiet rustle echoed from somewhere behind him, like something small and quick scurrying through the shadows. He told himself it was just the building settling, the harmless sounds of an old structure, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he moved from the lobby to the hallway, cleaning up stray bits of paper, emptying trash cans, and wiping down the counters, he found his mind drifting back to the list of rules in his pocket. He repeated each one silently, as though keeping them in mind could somehow protect him from whatever haunted this place. The air around him was thick with silence, a silence that felt alive, pressing in on him as though it had a presence of its own. Midnight was approaching. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change that made the room feel colder, the shadows sharper. It was then that he glanced at his watch, realizing he was moments away from the hour he'd been warned about. With a quick breath, he glanced up, his eyes falling on the row of windows along the far wall, their glass dark and reflective under the flickering lights. He could feel the rule pressing on his mind, do not look out the windows after midnight. The words echoed in his head, almost as if they were whispered by someone standing just behind him. It was absurd, he knew. It was just a rule, a silly, meaningless rule. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. Against his better judgment, he found himself edging closer, his heart pounding louder with every step. He knew he shouldn't, knew the rule was there for a reason he didn't understand. But the urge was too strong, the need to see what lay beyond the glass too great to resist. He stopped inches from the window, staring at the dark reflection of his own face. His skin was pale, his eyes wide, his breath fogging the glass in soft, uneven puffs. Slowly, as if in a trance, he shifted his gaze, looking beyond his reflection and into the night outside. At first he saw nothing but the emptiness of the parking lot, the cracked asphalt stretching out into the darkness, swallowed by the line of trees that loomed like silent sentinels. He was about to turn away, feeling almost relieved, when he noticed a figure, just barely visible at the edge of the parking lot, standing perfectly still, was a dark silhouette. It was tall, impossibly still, its shape undefined in the murky darkness. He squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained shrouded, its features hidden. He couldn't tell if it was facing him, but he felt its gaze, heavy and cold, pressing against him from across the lot. His breath caught, and an instinctual fear gripped him, a primal warning telling him to turn away, to break his gaze. But he was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the figure, as though something beyond his control held him there. The air grew thick around him, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own breathing. And then it was gone. In the blink of an eye, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness as though it had never been there. But in its place, there was a sound of faint, chilling whisper that seemed to come from the very walls around him. It was a voice, soft and distant, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in a dead forest, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. But whatever it was, it sounded almost familiar. He stumbled back from the window, his heart racing, his mind struggling to make sense of what he'd just seen. Had it really been there, or was it some trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees? The silence around him felt thicker now, suffocating, as though the motel itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He looked around the lobby, his eyes darting to every shadow, every flickering light, expecting to see something lurking just beyond his vision. His hands shook as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to convince himself it had been nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just broken a boundary, crossed some invisible line, that whatever he had seen was now aware of him, watching him from somewhere he couldn't see. For a moment he reached for the note in his pocket, his fingers brushing the crumpled paper, as though the rules could somehow protect him from whatever he'd just seen. But he knew the truth. He had broken the rule, and deep down he sensed that there would be consequences. He forced himself to turn away from the window, every nerve in his body screaming to look back, to make sure it hadn't returned. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he moved away, forcing himself to breathe, to focus on the silence of the empty motel. But as he walked, he could still feel the weight of that vanished figure, its eyes lingering in the back of his mind, a silent reminder of the rule he dared to break, and the darkness that now waited for him in the hours to come. The hours dragged on, each second pulling him deeper into a world that felt stranger, darker, as though the night itself had changed. He tried to focus on his tasks, to ignore the creeping fear that gnawed at him, but the silence around him had a weight to it, pressing against him like a cold, invisible hand. Every sound, every shadow seemed wrong, out of place, as though the motel were a living thing, shifting around him. It started with the lights. At first, just a slight flicker in the corner of his eye, a faint pulse that made him glance up, wondering if the bulb was dying. But then it happened again, and again, a steady, rhythmic flicker that danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with each dimming glow. The lights would sputter, struggling to hold, and each time they dimmed, the lobby grew darker, the shadows creeping closer, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of the light. Then came the whispers. He couldn't tell where they were coming from, but every now and then, he'd catch a faint murmur, a soft, distant sound, as though voices were speaking just out of earshot. They were unintelligible, a strange mix of syllables and breaths that seemed to drift through the air, brushing past his ears like a warning, like words meant for him but just barely out of reach. He would freeze, straining to catch a single word, a single sound, but each time he tried, the whispers faded, leaving only the steady, pounding silence. Not long after, he began to feel something else. A chill, thin and sharp, creeping along his skin, seeping through his clothes and into his bones. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, the kind of chill that carried the weight of something long dead, something that had lingered far too long in the dark. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to keep warm, but the cold wouldn't leave. It clung to him, slipping between the walls, sliding along the floor like a breath he couldn't see, curling around him as though it were alive. And then he felt a touch, just the faintest brush against his arm, light and fleeting, but unmistakable. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes scanning the empty hallway around him. But there was no one there, only shadows stretching into the distance. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination, but the touch had been real, soft and cold, like the hand of something that had once been alive, something that still remembered the feel of flesh. With each hour, the motel seemed to change, its air growing thick with a staleness that settled heavy in his lungs. The smell came gradually, a faint, sour odor that reminded him of rot, of something left too long in a place it shouldn't be. It was subtle at first, a faint whiff that he tried to ignore. But as the hours passed, it grew stronger, clinging to his skin, his clothes sinking into the walls like a stain that wouldn't wash away. Above him, the floorboards creaked, slow and deliberate, as though footsteps were moving in a careful, measured rhythm. He looked up, his eyes tracing the ceiling, but the sound moved, drifting from one end of the hallway to the other, always just beyond his reach. He tried to tell himself it was just the old building settling, the wood expanding in the night air, but he knew deep down that something was there. Something was moving, watching, waiting for him to let his guard down. Now and then he would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a shape, small and dark, sliding across the floor. He'd whip around, heart hammering, only to see the hallway empty, the shadow stretching long and thin in the flickering light. But he knew he wasn't imagining it. He could feel it, the presence of something just beyond sight, hiding in the spaces between the shadows, waiting for him to turn his back. As the clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., he found himself glancing back at the mirror in the lobby, its surface dark and murky, reflecting only the faintest glimmers of light. The rule echoed in his mind, louder now, a warning he couldn't ignore. Check the mirror in the lobby at exactly 3 a.m. He didn't want to. The thought of standing there, alone in front of that glass, made his skin crawl, as though something were already waiting on the other side, watching him with eyes he couldn't see. He wondered what he would find when he looked, if it would be his own reflection, or something else, something that had been waiting there since the night began. But he knew he had no choice. Whatever the rule meant, whatever waited in that glass, he had to follow it. The manager's words haunted him, their warning lingering like a threat he couldn't escape. You'll want to follow them. And as he glanced at his watch, watching the seconds tick closer to the hour, he felt the weight of those words pressing against him, a quiet reminder that this was more than just a job. This was a test he wasn't sure he could pass. The air grew colder as 3 a.m. approached, the silence thickening until it was almost painful, each tick of the clock echoing through the empty lobby. He took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he reached for the crumpled note in his pocket, the rules now worn from his nervous grip. He read it one last time, the words blurring slightly as his eyes traced the lines, the letters seeming to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand. And then, the clock struck 3. It was 3 a.m. The moment he'd been dreading, the rule he'd tried to forget was coming for him, as inevitable as the cold press of the night around him. With every step toward the lobby mirror, he felt the weight of the darkness thickening, closing in on him, as if the air itself had teeth, pressing into his skin, making each breath shorter, shallower. The hallway was silent, the only sound his own heartbeat, loud and frantic in his ears, echoing in the vast emptiness of the motel. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him forward even as his mind screamed to turn back, to run, to forget he'd ever seen that list of rules. But the thought of breaking this rule, of ignoring the silent command to check the mirror, filled him with a fear far deeper than anything he could explain. So he kept moving, one step after another, until he stood before the mirror, the cold glass just inches away, his own reflection staring back at him in the dim, flickering light. He forced himself to look at his reflection, his own pale face staring back at him. For a moment it was just him, his wide eyes, his trembling hands, his mouth drawn into a thin line as he struggled to control his breathing. But the longer he looked, the stranger his reflection seemed. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't belong. The figure in the mirror seemed darker, the shadows around it deeper, thicker, as though the reflection itself were a doorway, leading somewhere beyond the glass. He squinted, trying to shake off the feeling, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. His own face began to shift, subtly at first. A slight tilt of the head, a flicker in the eyes, and then it changed completely. His reflection twisted, its features warping, stretching as though they were being pulled from beneath. His eyes, once wide with fear, grew hollow, empty, blackened holes staring back at him with an unnatural emptiness. His mouth pulled into a twisted smile, wide and jagged, a grin that held no warmth, only a cold, mocking cruelty. The face in the mirror no longer looked like him, it looked like something else entirely. Something that had worn his skin and left only a hollow shell behind. The sight filled him with a primal, stifling fear, the kind that digs into your bones and freezes you in place. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. His gaze was locked with the thing in the mirror, the empty, hollow gaze that seemed to look past his eyes and into the very core of him. And as he watched, that twisted, hollow version of himself began to move. The figure's hand lifted, its movements slow, deliberate, as though it were reaching through the glass, trying to breach the barrier between worlds. His own hand, in reality, remained frozen at his side, but the reflection's hand rose, inching closer to the glass, its twisted grin widening, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, teeth that glistened in the dim light with an almost hungry gleam. And then, without warning, the figure's mouth began to move. At first, he couldn't hear it, but he could see the figure's mouth forming words, lips moving with an eerie slowness, as though savoring each sound. His heart thundered in his chest, the room spinning slightly as he strained to hear, to make out what it was saying. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint and chilling, curling around him like a cold breath. It was his name, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite his, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the mirror itself, from somewhere dark and distant, a place he could barely comprehend. "Come closer," it whispered, the words soft and drawn out, dripping with a dark, quiet hunger. "Let me in." A wave of nausea hit him, his skin crawling as the words seeped into his ears, filling his mind with a sense of dread so deep he thought he might pass out. He felt the presence on the other side of the glass growing stronger, pressing against the barrier, testing it, as if it were only a thin veil separating him from the thing that wore his face. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision changed. The figure's hand fell, its twisted smile fading, its eyes returning to their hollow, empty stare. For a split second it seemed to shimmer, to ripple, as though it were sinking into the depths of the mirror. And then it was gone. His own face stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, his breath fogging the glass in rapid bursts. He stumbled back, clutching his chest, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it echo in his ears. A steady, frantic drumbeat that matched the terror that gripped him. The mirror was empty now, his own reflection looking as it should. But the memory of that twisted smile, those hollow eyes, lingered, a dark stain on his mind that he couldn't shake. For a moment, he thought he heard the whisper again, faint and distant, his name drifting through the silence like a ghostly reminder of what he'd seen. But as he stood there, alone in the empty lobby, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been in that mirror, whatever had worn his face, it wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching from somewhere beyond the glass. A presence that had brushed against him, leaving a mark he could feel, deep and cold, a reminder that he was no longer alone in the Withered Pines Motel. As he turned away from the mirror, feeling the weight of its gaze pressing into his back, he could still feel it, the quiet, chilling whisper of his own name echoing in his ears. And somewhere in the depths of the motel, he knew the darkness was waiting for him, ready to pull him deeper, to show him things he wasn't meant to see, things that would haunt him long after the night was over. This mirror scene piques the suspense, delivering a chilling, vivid encounter with the supernatural. The twisted reflection and the whispered name build a sense of profound unease, pushing the protagonist and the viewer to the edge of fear. This sequence leaves the protagonist shaken, haunted by the experience, setting up the story's deepening tension as he realizes the motel's horrors are far from over. Now, let me ask you, what would you do if you were him? Standing there, alone in the middle of the night, staring into a mirror, only to see yourself staring back with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't belong. Would you keep looking, or would you turn away, afraid of what else you might find? If you think you'd dare to stay, if you think you'd be brave enough to keep your eyes on that twisted reflection, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you'd do, standing in front of that darkened glass with nothing but your own shadow for company. But remember, this was only the beginning. What he saw in the mirror was just a glimpse, a warning of the things that lingered in the shadows of the Withered Pines Motel. Because somewhere in the depths of that empty hallway, something was watching him, something that knew he had broken a rule. And as the night stretched on, it would come for him, waiting for just the right moment to reveal itself. The worst was yet to come, and he would learn all too soon that some rules are meant to be broken, but never without consequence. This mid-video segment engages viewers, prompting them to imagine themselves in the protagonist's shoes, questioning how they would react in such a chilling moment. The teaser hints at escalating horrors, suggesting that the protagonist's ordeal is far from over, building anticipation for what lies ahead and keeping the audience intrigued and involved. As the minutes ticked by, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever he had seen in the mirror, whatever twisted reflection had stared back at him, wasn't just some trick of the mind, it was something real, something that wanted him to see it, to know it was there. And the motel felt different now. Every shadow seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that he was not alone. The silence was thick, suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides, as if the building itself were alive, aware of his every movement. He found himself drawn to the back office, a small, cramped room filled with old, dusty filing cabinets and boxes piled haphazardly in the corners. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and paper that had been left untouched for years. It was a relic of another time, forgotten by everyone except those who had lingered within its walls, people who had once worked here, maybe even people who had stayed behind when they shouldn't have. With trembling hands, he began rummaging through the files, his fingers sifting through yellowed pages, faded photographs, receipts, and guest logs that hadn't been touched in decades. Every now and then he would come across a name scribbled hastily, dates long past, and notes in handwriting that looked nervous, hurried. And as he read, a sense of dread settled over him, a realization that there was a pattern here, hidden within the scattered papers and fragmented notes. Then he found it. Tucked away in the back of a drawer, beneath a pile of dusty receipts, was an old ledger, its cover worn and tattered, the pages brittle under his touch. As he opened it, he saw the name of a night shift worker scrawled in faded ink, Richard Hale. The name felt strangely familiar, almost like an echo from somewhere in his mind, as if he'd heard it whispered in the quiet of the motel. Flipping through the pages, he found notes written by Richard himself, a diary of sorts, entries scrawled in a messy, frantic hand. "Something isn't right here," one entry read. "There are rules I don't understand, rules that don't make sense. But they say to follow them, that it's the only way to stay safe." The entries grew more erratic as the days went on, Richard's writing becoming frantic, desperate, detailing strange noises in the halls, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and whispers in the dark. And then, the entries stopped abruptly. No conclusion, no goodbye, just silence. It was as if Richard had simply vanished. And as the protagonist flipped to the last page, his breath caught at the final words scrawled across the bottom of the page, written with a trembling hand, "Do not break the rules. They're watching, always watching." Richard Hale had disappeared. No one had seen him since, no record of his life after that night, no trace of where he might have gone. But as he read the entries again, he couldn't shake the feeling that Richard hadn't left at all, that he was still here, trapped within the walls of the motel, watching from the shadows. The deeper he dug, the more he found fragments of stories, whispers of rumors that the Withered Pines Motel was cursed, that it had claimed those who didn't follow its rules. Each rule, he realized, wasn't some arbitrary guideline or quirky tradition. They were boundaries, barriers that kept something contained, something that lingered just beyond sight. Breaking them was a breach, an invitation, a way for the darkness within the motel to take hold. There was a sickening logic to it, a twisted sense to each rule. Do not look out the windows after midnight, because to do so was to invite the shadows in, to let them see you as much as you saw them. If you hear a knock on room 13, ignore it, because whatever was behind that door wasn't a guest, it was something far older, something that waited for a curious soul to let it out. And check the mirror at exactly 3 a.m. A ritual to ensure that the barrier held, to ensure that whatever lived within the glass stayed behind the veil. As he pieced together the fragments of the curse, a chill settled over him, the cold weight of understanding pressing down on his shoulders. Each rule was a lifeline, a way to survive the night without becoming part of the motel's shadowed history. They were protections fragile and fleeting, the only thing standing between him and the fate that had claimed those before him. And Richard, poor Richard, had broken them, whether by accident or defiance, and he had paid the price. He had become one of them, a twisted figure, lost in the motel's endless night, bound to its walls, his face hollow and empty, waiting for the next to join him. A wave of nausea washed over him as the truth sank in, filling him with a cold, hollow dread. He was trapped, bound by the same rules, walking the same halls where others had disappeared, following the same rules they had broken. And he knew now, beyond any doubt, that he wasn't alone here. The shadows that moved, the whispers in the dark, the figure he'd seen outside the window, they were all souls like Richard, souls who had broken the rules, who had been claimed by the motel, twisted and trapped, waiting for someone else to join them. He backed away from the desk, his heart racing, his mind reeling with the weight of what he'd uncovered. There was no way out, no escape from the motel's grasp. The only way to survive was to follow the rules, to obey the strange, eerie commands that kept him safe for now. But as he glanced around the empty office, the walls closing in around him, he realized something chilling. The night wasn't over, and the rules were only going to get harder to keep. As the night dragged into its darkest hours, he felt himself unraveling, his mind fraying at the edges as the silence pressed down on him, thick and relentless. The motel had grown colder, the shadows sharper, darker, as though they were alive, pulsing with an awareness that seeped into his bones. Each breath was a struggle, his heart pounding in his chest, every beat a reminder that he was still trapped within the motel's grip, bound by the rules that kept him clinging to a fragile thread of sanity. And then it came, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. A knock, sharp, deliberate, echoing down the hall. He froze, his pulse racing, his breath catching as the sound reached him, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide. But he knew where it was coming from. He didn't even have to turn. Room 13. The one door he had been warned about, the one door he was never supposed to answer. He closed his eyes, the rule repeating itself over and over in his mind, a mantra that was both a warning and a desperate plea. If you hear a knock on room 13, ignore it. Do not answer. But the knocking grew louder, harder, like something was throwing its weight against the door, demanding entry, its insistence echoing down the empty hallway, filling his ears, drowning out every other sound. He pressed his hands over his ears, backing away, trying to block it out, to silence the noise, but it was inside his head, a relentless pounding that matched the frantic beat of his heart. He tried to remember the faces of the others, the ones who had broken the rules, who had vanished into the motel's shadows, lost to the curse that bound them to this place. He could see Richard's name scrawled in his mind, could feel the weight of those who had come before him, their warnings, their desperate pleas to obey the rules. But the knocking wouldn't stop. It was louder now, closer, as though it was right outside his door, as though the walls themselves were trembling with the force of it. He whispered to himself, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding in his head, repeating the rule like a prayer: do not answer. Do not answer, but the sound was relentless, an unending hammering that filled the air, wrapping around him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. And as the moments dragged on, he felt his resolve weaken, his mind slipping further into the darkness that waited just beyond that door. Finally, something broke. A crack in his mind, a fissure that spread through his thoughts like a spider's web, pulling him to his feet, guiding his trembling hands toward the door. He didn't want to open it. He knew what waited for him, knew that crossing this threshold meant stepping into a place he could never escape. But the sound had become unbearable, a presence of its own, pulling him forward, tugging at the frayed edges of his sanity. With a shaking hand, he reached for the doorknob, his fingers brushing the cold metal as a chill seeped into his bones, colder than anything he had ever felt. His breath caught, his heart racing as he twisted the knob, feeling it give beneath his hand, the door swinging open with a slow, agonizing creak. He stared into the darkness beyond, an endless, suffocating void that seemed to swallow the light, stretching into a place he couldn't understand, a place that was both nowhere and everywhere. Shadows moved within the darkness, figures that shifted and twisted, their whispers filling the air, brushing against his skin like a cold, unseen hand. He felt their eyes on him, their hollow, empty gaze piercing into his mind, pulling him deeper, urging him to step forward, to join them. He tried to turn back, to pull himself from the door, but the darkness had him, its weight dragging him forward, pulling him into its depths, surrounding him on all sides. The whispers grew louder, each voice blending into the next, a cacophony of sound that filled his mind, drowning out every thought, every memory, until he was nothing but a shadow himself, a part of the endless void. And then, through the whispers, he heard it, the voice of his reflection, the hollow, twisted smile that had stared back at him from the mirror. "You broke the rules," it whispered, its tone soft, mocking, filled with a dark satisfaction. "Now you've let us out." He felt the shadows press against him, closing in, their cold hands reaching out, touching his skin, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice swallowed by the void, his body slipping further and further from reality, from light, from life. And then nothing. For a moment there was silence. No sound, no light, nothing but the endless, consuming darkness, stretching on forever. The screen went black, as if the horror had ended, as if he had been swallowed whole, leaving nothing behind but an empty, hollow void. The darkness faded slowly, the whispers slipping away, and then he was back. Standing in the lobby of the motel, the same dim lights flickering overhead, the familiar stretch of dusty carpet beneath his feet. For a moment he felt an overwhelming relief, a wave of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had imagined it all. The curse, the shadows, the twisted face in the mirror, it was over. He was back. But something was wrong. The air felt thicker, colder, as though it had been tainted by something dark, something that clung to him, wrapped around him like a second skin. He looked around, his eyes tracing the walls, the shadows. Everything was the same. And yet it all felt different. He felt different. He moved to the mirror on the wall, the same one he had faced at 3 a.m., the glass still clouded and streaked with age. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand reaching up to touch his face, his fingers brushing against his skin, trying to ground himself, to feel something familiar. But as he stared into the mirror, he saw it, his own reflection staring back, twisted and wrong, just as it had been hours before. His eyes hollow, empty, black pits that stared back with a dark hunger, a bottomless void that seemed to stretch forever. His lips twisted into that same crooked grin, wide and unnatural, stretching across his face in a way that didn't belong to him, a grin that held no warmth, no humanity. He was looking at himself, and yet it wasn't him. Not anymore. Slowly, the truth settled over him, a cold, choking dread that wrapped around his heart, squeezing until he could barely breathe. He had become one of them, just like Richard, just like all the others who had come before him. The curse had taken him, twisted him, turned him into one of the shadows that haunted the halls of the Withered Pines Motel. He wasn't a guest anymore. He wasn't even alive, not in the way he had been. He was part of the darkness now, a silent figure lurking in the corners, waiting, watching for the next poor soul to break the rules. He backed away from the mirror, his hollow eyes wide, his twisted grin frozen in place, a face that was both his own and something else entirely. And as he moved through the lobby, he felt at the motel's pull, a dark energy guiding him, compelling him to wait, to linger in the shadows, to take his place among the cursed. The realization settled in, heavy and final. He was no longer just a man working the night shift. He was something else now, something that lived within the walls of the Withered Pines Motel, bound to its darkness, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to walk through its doors. And as he stood there, the flickering lights casting long shadows across his hollow, twisted face. A single thought passed through his mind, one last, lingering warning to anyone who dared to listen. For those of you who survived this tale, if you made it through the night with him, I have to warn you, the story doesn't end here. The Withered Pines Motel has many secrets, and this was just one of them. So stay tuned, because the darkness has even darker stories to tell. Now, I want to know what you think. What do you think was behind Room 13? Share your theories in the comments and tell us how you'd survive a night in the Withered Pines Motel. Would you have obeyed the rules, or would curiosity have gotten the best of you? But remember, the darkness here is only the beginning. Think this story was terrifying? Just wait until you hear about the next encounter, another night shift worker, another place shrouded in shadows. Because there's more. Places hidden across lonely highways, places we pass without a second thought. And once you hear their stories, it'll make you think twice about being alone, about closing your eyes in the dark, about the whispers you ignore in empty hallways. They say that every place has its secrets. Some places were never meant to be found, and others were never meant to let you leave. So if you're ready to face the shadows again, if you think you can handle another night with the darkness watching, then stay with us, because this is only the beginning.
If you found yourself on edge watching our tale unfold, craving more stories that delve into the shadows and secrets lurking in forgotten places, then don't let the darkness keep you alone. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a moment of the eerie and unexplained. Join our community of fellow thrill seekers and keep exploring the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Share your theories in the comments below. What do you think is truly behind Room 13?